All right. And I'm going to share my screen. You could just give me a thumbs up. Are you all seeing the first slide? Thank you very much. Okay. So welcome. My name is Dana Page. We're going to go ahead and get started at 6 o'clock, and we have a tight agenda, so we'll go ahead and begin. We are providing translation for this meeting, and I'm going to go ahead and invite our translator to provide information to people who might need to access translation services.
Buenas noches. ¿Hay servicios de interpretación en español para la reunión de hoy? Para poder acceder a los servicios de interpretación en español, van ustedes a ver en la parte de abajo de su pantalla un icono con un globo terráqueo. Cuando hagan clic en el icono del globo terráqueo, van a poder elegir el idioma español o Spanish. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. So this is the second of our 6 special meetings. We'll have 6 special sessions followed by a meeting of the Board of Education in a specially scheduled meeting in sometime April or May. And as a reminder, the meeting format is made so that it can be accessible to the public and also to create a space for the committee to be able to do their work. So we are publicly and live streaming the meeting right now. And we have some people tuned in. Thank you very much. And then it also will be recorded and posted on our website, so folks who aren't able to be with us live will be able to watch it later on. At times during the meeting, we will break out into small group work to allow this fairly large panel of about 50 people to be able to get into some smaller groups to get some questions answered, to discuss the information, and just be able to process in a space that's a little more conducive than this quite large group. We will have opportunity for public comment later on in the forums as we move into the stages where we're actually discussing concrete proposals. Our agenda tonight is focused heavily on information gathering. It will be actually a lot of information. We did share this ahead of time with folks. So I want to just let you know that we're going to start off with a quick norm review, and then we're going to dive into these topics of study. So we're going to focus on enrollment trends and facilities capacity, capital improvement costs and facility modernization. And then, as we like to do after you've been shared a lot of information, we like to give our group time to process and discuss and make sure that the learning is really isn't just peppered at you, but you're having an opportunity to really think about what you're hearing. And along the way, we will pause. We're gonna have 2 presenters. We will pause after each presenter to be able to answer questions that you will have. We understand that and expect that there will be a lot of questions given the amount of content that we're gonna present. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we're gonna do that. So I'm gonna introduce Sarah Knox to you, or reintroduce Sarah Knox. She is our Director 3 of Intervention and Prevention. And she is the brainchild behind our processing activities, and she's come up with another great one for you tonight. She's also going to walk us through our norms, and then she's going to talk a little bit about what that processing activity will look like. Go ahead, Sarah.
Good evening, everyone. Again, our procedural norms, just a reminder, these were our same norms as our first meeting. We will start and end on time. We will be sharing the air. You can use the hand raise button to speak, and otherwise keep on mute. Take breaks as needed. And for this session, we ask that you, for questions and answers during the content heavy portion of tonight's session, we ask that you use the guide that's on your participant guide. So Dana, if you want to click on that for a second and it will open it up. You can record questions that you have during either Mr. Manguala or Mr. Pearson's presentations tonight. There's sections on the participant guide for both enrollment and budget questions and then facilities questions. And we just ask that you record your questions there so that we're moving through all of the content, making sure that we're able to cover everything. And then we will be stopping to address some of those questions during the presentation as well. All right, thanks, Amy. You can go back to the slides. And in general, we just ask that you remain committed to these general norms of asking questions, being engaged, integrating new information and ideas, opening your mind to diverse views, and to utilize what you learn to make decisions.
Thank you. All right, so each time we just want to ground the group in the task at hand. So while we gather lots of information, please remember the purpose of this group, which is to solve a problem. We have too many middle schools that are operating in the city of Napa, given our current and projected enrollment. So there's going to be lots of important information and interesting information that is presented, and it may you know, really spark a lot of thinking and questions in you, and there may be a temptation to want to go deep into some bits of information. But we are pressed on time, and we want to make sure that we get to all the relevant questions. So, you know, before you do pose a question into either the written space that Sarah has provided, or if we have time to also take questions after that, please try to think about to what degree the information you're asking is furthering our ability to tackle this question, and it's an important question, or maybe it's just an interesting question, and there might be a better time to follow up on that. And I think you may have noticed there is a parking lot on the question. So if it isn't related to facilities and enrollment and budget and the items that are presented, it might be a question that, you know, comes to you because you're thinking of that, and then something else sparks your interest. If it's not related to those two, then we ask that you put it in the parking lot. And there's a good chance that it may be coming up later on in the sessions, and we'll make sure that we're able to incorporate an answer at some point in some of these work sessions. So with that, I do hear some feedback, so I just want to reiterate that you should be on mute if you're not actively speaking. Thank you. So another reminder from our last session is that we are using guiding principles throughout this process. Whenever we're discussing possible solutions, we're going to take a look at how those solutions line up and to what degree they tick the boxes here in these 4 areas. So we are looking for eventually a solution that promotes program excellence, that is fiscally solvent, that is responsible facility management, and that promotes equity. So again, tonight, I invite you, as you're listening, to use this as your framework for really listening to the presenters and thinking about how our current situation that they're going to illuminate does or does not meet some of these guiding principles, and what work we need to continue to do. So again, tonight's focus is enrollment trends, facility capacity. And we talk a little bit about the cost of improving facilities and long-term needs. In future sessions, we'll be going deeper into student demographics, performance data, instructional programs, because we understand the picture is very big. It encompasses a lot of different aspects. And tonight is just a snapshot on these specific topics, but we will expand and continue to talk about our schools from a different lens in future sessions. So with that, just a reminder, I think we already covered this about how we're going to handle the Q&A. Please put your questions, write them down. Sarah and I will be monitoring that as we go. And then if we find, some light questions, we can combine them or just kind of synthesize them for the group and try to get as quickly as possible through your questions. With that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our first presenter. We have Rob Mangwala. He is the Assistant Superintendent of Business Services, and he will be presenting to you tonight on a couple of topics, including enrollment trends.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about enrollment trends. Next slide, please. My presentation will cover what goes into enrollment projections, current enrollment, projected enrollment, demographics of our middle schools, and an overview of our budget. Next slide. When you think of any projection, you may wonder what goes into the projection and how accurate it is. Some districts compute their enrollment projections internally, while others use a demographer. Due to the importance of this data, we use a demographer. Our demographer has been exceptionally accurate. As a matter of fact, he has an accuracy rate of over 99%. Enrollment projections start with birth rates in the county. Essentially, if you see a certain number of births in the zip code in and around the district, this will translate into a certain percentage of students entering your schools about 5 years later when they enter kindergarten. These numbers are increased or decreased based on the likeliness that they will stay in your system or your school system. Some students move away, other students move in. This is referred to as a cohort survival rate. Next slide. In a typical year, enrollment in California schools drop by about 20 to 30,000 students. However, enrollment projections by the state indicate that the enrollment decline due to the pandemic is about 155 students, or about 5 times the typical decline. A lot of things contribute to this, especially the lack of affordability in housing in California. Also, a mass exodus out of the coastal regions to less expensive areas such as Idaho and Arizona. Next slide. As you can see, enrollment has significantly declined since 2014 and will continue to decline going forward into the foreseeable future. For example, enrollment is expected to decline by about 2,000 students over the next 6 years. Based on an estimated amount of revenues of about $10,000 per student, this translates into a revenue loss of about $20 million. Next slide. This slide depicts enrollment at our middle schools as of February 1st, 2021. As you can see, our largest middle school is American Canyon, followed by Redwood, Silverado, Harvest, and River. While River is the smallest middle school, it is important to note that it is also our newest school, having opened at their new site in 2020-2021. Next slide. When you examine declining enrollment, it occurs in a predictable pattern that begins with smaller and smaller groups of students entering kindergarten. As these smaller groups enter the school district, larger groups of 12th graders leave the district. Since Napa has had declining enrollment for some time, you can even see this pattern when examining middle school enrollment data by grade level. For example, there are a total of 1,289 8th grade students that attend middle school. However, there are only 1,243 7th grade students, or a loss of about 46 students. I reversed the grades on that. So 1,289 8th grade, 1,243 7th grade. Next slide. This slide showed our projected enrollment for each school over the next 5 years. While the enrollment for each school can differ, as this is impacted by parent choice and district open enrollment policy, the overall trend does not change. When examining enrollment patterns as a whole, projected enrollment will continue to decline. I just wanted to point out a quick note about American Canyon. As you can see by this slide, that it does kind of buck the trend. And so the reason for American Canyon and their flat enrollment is typically due to our ability to allow inter-district transfer students from neighboring areas, such as Vallejo. Also, one thing that's occurring for 2025-26, there is a very large 3rd grade class working its way through the system. So by the time 2025-26 comes, that bubble will land. Next slide. In terms of measuring socioeconomic status, the gold standard is the percentage of students who qualify for free or reduced lunch. The average for the district is about 47%. This is about 12% lower than the state average. You can see that both Harvest and Silverado are essentially the same at about 63%. This is followed by Redwood, American Canyon, and River, which is less than half the district average. Next slide. In terms of second language learners, Harvest has the highest number of second language learners. This is primarily due to the location of the dual immersion Spanish program. Next slide. The next series of slides compares ethnicity at each middle school to the district. At the Napa area middle schools, except for River, the ethnicity pretty much mirrors the district, with the largest ethnicity being the Latinx community, followed by white students. Redwood and Harvest have the largest Latinx community at about 75% each. This slide shows ethnicity at Redwood, which shows that the Latinx and white community, again, are both the largest communities. Next slide. Silverado essentially matches Redwood. And Silverado is also fairly close. Again, our Napa area schools, the demographics of our Napa area schools are essentially the same, except for River, which does buck the trend a little bit. Next slide. This slide compares ethnicity of American Canyon Middle School to the district. This data shows that American Canyon Middle School is our most diverse middle school, with 6 different ethnicities with a population greater than 5%. Next slide. This slide shows that River School does not quite match the ethnicity of the other schools. So you can see the primary ethnicity at River is the white demographic, with our Latinx students coming in about half. Next slide. During our last meeting, there was a question about district boundary. And so what this slide does is it shows the district boundary as a whole. The next group of slides, I will demonstrate each slide. That's fine right there, Dana. Each boundary for each school. So these are our middle school boundaries. You can see the Napa proper area essentially has 3 boundaries, with the biggest being Silverado, followed by Redwood and Harvest, and then American Canyon to the south. And again, River Middle School does not have a boundary. Next slide. This slide shows that the vast majority of our students live in central Napa, followed by American Canyon. So again, the vast majority of our students, they do reside in the 29 corridor. The different colors represents the schools that they attend. It's not really something that belongs on this slide more in terms of percentages, but the intent of this slide is just to show again where the vast majority of our students are, which is central Napa and American Canyon. Next slide. At this point, I'm going to transition into a very brief discussion about our budget. If you would like a more thorough discussion about our budget, I did do a presentation at a previous board meeting for first interim, and then I will be providing an update at second interim later on this year. Next slide. COVID-19 has created a great deal of uncertainty. While the overall economy has not slowed as fast as we once thought it would, it has nonetheless slowed substantially. The largest impact for schools is that COVID-19 has led to a greater than expected number of families to leave California. So again, as a result of COVID-19, the decline in enrollment has definitely gotten much worse. This obviously impacts school funding. Next slide. So you might wonder, well, how does a school district prepare itself for uncertainty? The best way for a school district to prepare for uncertainty is to examine the data closely and make data-based decisions. The number one piece of data to examine is enrollment trends. As you can see from my previous slides, the enrollment trends in Napa indicate a very significant enrollment decline. So again, what's the primary driver of revenue? Again, the primary driver of revenue in a school district is enrollment. What are some of the other things that we can do in terms of preparing for uncertainty? We need to make sure and reduce spending and do not deficit spend. We need to continue to build up our reserves. Again, a reserve is the money that you put aside for the future. The minimum required reserve is 3%. If you get below 3%, you can be taken over by the state. You need to examine unsustainable programs very closely. And also you need to ensure that your staffing and facilities match your future needs. Next slide. So right now our reserves are sitting just above our district policy of about 7.5%. You can see if you look back to 2017-18, we're hovering right around state takeover at about 3%. We've done a lot of work in terms of bringing down some of our costs, but again, we still have work to do. And it's really important to prepare for the decline in enrollment that's coming in our very near future and occurring right now. Next slide. So one second. So what are some of the operational costs that go into a middle school? So when you look at operational costs for a middle school, what you want to look at is your fixed costs. You do not put any of your instructional costs that follow students forever. For example, you would never put teachers in there. However, you do get some savings from placing students a little more efficiently. You look at actual administrator and clerical costs that you wouldn't have when you close a site. You look at actual district-wide custodial maintenance and utility costs. And then what you do is you apply a square footage factor. And then also you look at support for the cafeteria program. Next slide. So on this slide, it shows the operational costs of a large middle school. And so the operational cost for a large middle school is about $2 million a year. In the event of the closure of a facility, the savings, the $2 million savings, 100% of it does not happen in the first year. That happens over a number of years. In the first year, you typically get about half of that. And then once you close the facility completely, you're no longer paying utilities, and you eventually sell the facility is where you see the total savings. Next slide. So this slide is a summary slide of our budget. In terms of looking at our budget, school districts are required to do a multi-year projection and look at your revenues, your expenses, and your reserves over the course of 3 years. Over that course of 3 years, we are required to keep a minimum reserve of 3%. So you can see once we get out to the third year that we're barely at 3%, and we're at 3.42%. And then the important part is to always remember the assumptions that you put in there. So based on in order to meet that 3.42%, there's an assumption that we'll save $350,000 in ongoing certificate of management reductions beginning in 2021-22, approximately $480,000 cuts in certificated cuts due to declining enrollment, $200,000 in cuts in classified salaries. And then there's also an assumption of the closure of a middle school and the savings of approximately $1 million from that closure. So if we do not close a middle school, we'd have to look for other ways to save about $1 million. And then the other thing to remember is revenues are anticipated to drop by about $6 million in year 3 due to declining enrollment. So this is something that we'll watch very closely. We may need to look at additional cuts at second interim once we get final numbers for our budget. This concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Rob. So I'm going to keep on the slideshow in case some of the questions it might be helpful to refer back to a slide. And Sarah, are you able to, or do we have questions first of all?
We do have questions, yes.
Okay, and so we have about 10 minutes to cover some questions at this point. You want to go ahead and pose the question, and then Rob will have you answer, and if you want me to refer back to a slide, I'll try to find that.
Yep, I am trying to get back to the participant guide, sorry. Okay, so the first question that is here is how many students open enroll at each site, and which is their school of choice?
Can that be rephrased a little bit? So I'm not quite certain of the question. So is the question how many people get their first choice?
I think maybe what percentage, if we know it offhand, and it may be something we have to follow up with some information, but what percentage of students or the number of students who are open enrolled to the school? I think actually Mr. Pearson has a slide that comes up later that talks about the number of students who
open
are
enrollment versus
who are resident students versus open enrolled. So that might be a good question.
Yeah, so that's a good, we'll refer to that slide. So I think that's what the question is. But in terms of choice, we generally give people the choice that they want. There's usually not a scenario that doesn't occur. So for the most part, we always try and give everybody their first choice. But in terms of students in boundary versus out of boundary, I think Mr. Pearson does have a slide on that.
Mm-hmm.
I also think it's important to remember we do have one school that's 100% open enrolled, which is River.
Correct.
The next question that is on here is how many 6th grade students are at MBLA? And I'm not sure if someone typed in this answer, but it says 83 students as of December of 2020.
Yes, that's about correct. That sounds about right. So usually NBLA, it starts with about 100 students in kinder is the way they build their cohorts. And then as it progresses through the system, it drops down to about 88 students in 6th grade. Some of the students actually end up at Harvest. So it's not 100% of the students choose to stay at NBLA for 6th grade.
And then this is a corollary question. Could you please speak about Harvest Middle School's 6th grade enrollment due to MBLA students only attending in 7th and 8th grade?
Well, you can, can you go to the slide that has 6th grade in there? No. There's an enrollment one. Yeah, right here. Oh, there it is. And so, yes, you can see that 6th grade always does have a lower number due to some of the students going to NBLA. And so, yes, that's as of 2/1/21, that is the 188 students in 6th grade. And however, the thing to remember is that the decline is still happening. So even if you take that away, and so if you go back to my notes where I compared cohort sizes, I took that into consideration. I did not compare 6th grade to 8th grade because of the NBLA, the impact of NBLA. I did compare 7th grade to 8th grade. So even when you look 7th grade to 8th grade, you can see that, again, even in all of our schools, essentially, except for American Canyon, there's a smaller cohort of 7th grade following 8th grade. So which means next year's enrollment, for example, for Harvest will not be 264 in 8th grade. It will be some factor of 232, that number reduced by some factor.
The next question is, can we please see data regarding the comment that Harvest Middle School's ELL population or numbers are due to our DI students?
Yes. It's not going to be 100% of the reason why. And so there's different ways to look at it. It certainly has an impact on it. So Harvest does have, can you go back to that slide?
Yeah.
So if you look at the English learner population for Harvest, so again, what's the district average is 21%. Silverado is 25%. And Harvest is definitely the largest, 29.7%. Part of that is due to DLI because you have the DLI program. Part of it can be due to the neighborhood. You would have to completely drill down, but the big picture is it is the highest in the district. It's about 5% higher than others, but again, looking, it's not substantially higher. So again, looking at Redwood's sitting at 21, the district's at 21, and Silverado's at 25.
The next question is, are the year 2 revenue numbers because of a hold harmless from the state? A $6 million drop seems sudden.
Somebody in the background there knows school finance very well, and that's exactly right. So the reason for that is essentially for this year, we have last year's enrollment numbers or ADA. What will happen is since they did not take ADA this year, or they did not record enrollment for financial purposes is another way to put it, for next year's numbers, we'll also get last year's numbers. So that's why they're essentially stable. In the 3rd year, we'll get the enrollment drop.
The next question asks about walking data. Are they able to see walking data for each middle school? And
So
assume that
the
number
term,
of students
yeah,
would-
so in terms of walking, so that's not the term that we would use. I mean, that's something that obviously you'd watch for. It'd be really hard to quantify that. But in terms of looking at miles traveled for something like that, that is a term that we do use. I'm looking at that now. I do not have that analysis. It's a pretty complex analysis. But in terms of how far each residence is who attends the school, who actually attends the schools, is from their house, that is a calculation that we can look at.
We could bring that specific calculation. I think, again, the information that we'll get to later on that talks about where people are living and attending school might kind of hint a little bit at that, but then Rob can provide a little more detail later on.
If I were to summarize, like, you know, in terms of my analysis that I've done, I can definitely make the statement that the furthest miles traveled would be for River, since it's an open enrollment school. If I recall right off the top of my head, the average there is 4 or 5 miles. All the other middle schools are within a couple miles.
I think the other, I'm going to make an assumption that maybe underlying that question too might be, do we have information on how many kids who attend a school currently would also be potentially walking to that school? For instance, how many of the kids that attend River or Silverado are walking there? How many of the kids that attend Harvest are walking there? I'm not sure if we have that data.
Yeah, no, that's not that, you know, again, that would be qualitative data unless you sit out there and actually watch them. You couldn't do that, but you can make an assumption and just draw. You could just essentially take every address for every student attending and subtract that away from the school address, and then you get a calculation called miles traveled. And then you just, you know, you can make an assumption. If a student is, I mean, we can place that line anywhere you want. We could say, if the student is within a mile, they're probably walking, or they're within a half a mile. I'm not sure. I mean, that's, you know, a decision that we would need to make, but I could definitely quantify it and say how far they are.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question, Sarah.
Yep. So this question I believe was already addressed, but I just want to make sure that it was fully addressed. So Harvest has 684 students in total, but currently MBLA keeps about 86 graders at the elementary school. And if added, the total number would go to 764 students. Are we taking this into consideration? And if these students move to Harvest in 6th grade, it would increase the percentage of English learners.
There is no assumption based on that, right? So that those types of assumptions would come into play when we're considering plans for the future or what we want to do as a task force. So when we start to model different task force recommendations is when we would look at something like that. And so yes, I mean, you could make an assumption that if NBLA did not have a 6th grade, would it be larger? I don't, of course it would be larger, but the exact number, I mean, I don't know the exact number.
And I
Just
go ahead, Dana.
ask if maybe it's possible to make a connection here with the middle school enrollment slide. If this is the 7th grade class, and we know that some of the students join from NVLA at 7th grade, even if you were to use this difference between the 7th and 6th and assume that 100% of the 6th graders would come over, which we know that not 100% of them do, but if you were to assume that, the difference might add about 20 or about 50 or so kids to the mix.
Yeah, and so if you were to, thank you for pointing that out, Dana. So if you were to, again, let's just take 6th grade completely out of it, because we know that the students are at NVLA. Just look at 7th and 8th grade, because again, by 7th grade, all the students that would attend NVLA would be at Harvest. And so again, just if you were to just add up, look at 7th grade and 8th grade, you can still see that again, it would be 232 plus 264, 260 plus 298, and then Silverado 235 plus 257.
All right, thank you. We're going to stop there for questions, but we have them recorded, and if we need to, we can come back and find other ways to address some of that information. We're going to go on to our next speaker. Thank you very much, Rob. Appreciate it. And oh, sorry, going too fast. Here we are. We're going to turn our focus onto facilities with Assistant Superintendent Mike Pearson.
All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Ms. Page, for that introduction. If you go to the next slide, please. So my presentation today will focus on capacity and capital improvements for schools, for the schools in Napa. So let's first focus our energy on the capacity of Napa middle schools. So if you go to the next slide, please. So one of the things you have to take into account when you're thinking about capacity, and I'll get to some numbers in a minute here, but you do have to take into consideration significant Napa housing development out there as part of the overall picture. Now I know many people have been looking at and been anticipating Napa Pipe coming on board, and that is listed as the first development here. It is scheduled to have 803 single-family detached and 142 affordable homes. Those the boundary though for that particular development is split fairly evenly amongst Harvest and Silverado Middle School. The earliest that we'll see any units from that particular development start to happen will be in the year 2023. And I think it's important to note here that actually the development is hinging upon the infrastructure being built in for Costco. That's actually the first thing that's supposed to happen in Napa Pipe. And before Costco can go in, the developer has to put in all the infrastructure surrounding that particular parcel, because that is not what Costco does. Costco puts up 4 big walls and a roof, and they call it good. And they stock it full of a lot of products. They do not do infrastructure. So that's the first thing that has to happen with that. But when that does happen, that's what's going to happen first. And then followed by that will be the development. And there are approximately 8 blocks that they call them, 9 blocks that they call them out there at this particular development in Napa Pipe. I think that's significant to also note that this project is phased out. So there's a phase 1 project at Napa Pipe, a phase 2 project at Napa Pipe, and then finally a phase 3 at Napa Pipe. Napa Pipe runs essentially north and south. It is west of Highway 29. You would enter it off of Kaiser Road. And there's another interesting fact to point out with Napa Pipe, and that is that the train track, the Union, I believe it's Union Pacific, separates the property almost in half. And so part of it, what they're developing first is they would be developing land, the Costco and the resident areas, they would be operating east of that railroad track. Apparently, and I'm hearing this, through the city of Napa and some other sources here, so I don't have all the exact language on this. But in a nutshell, it is very difficult to cross over a train track, is what I'm hearing, because it has some federal guidelines that go along with that. So they're going to first develop everything east of the train tracks. Then they will cross over the train tracks and they start to develop the southern portion of the property on the west side of the train tracks, and then subsequently the ones on the east side, on the north side of that property. But that requires them to also cross the train tracks again. And again, I'm hearing this through the city of Napa folks and some others, that it requires some special litigation to be able to cross train tracks one direction and then cross them again. That being said, if that all comes to fruition, and again, the earliest we'd see any units, the most middle school students that we would see generated, and again, middle school students would be 54 students total for the entire project. Now, when we initially entered into agreement with Napa Pipe back in, I believe it was 2012, 2013, we were looking at that time for a total amount of students, K-12, of 300 students. And so you can see that it's really not going to generate the type of students that we thought that it was going to generate out there, at least at one point, from a middle school, from a totality, but also from the middle school standpoint. And then subsequently, there are a variety of other projects happening throughout Napa that you can read and you can see what the generation of students, again, this is for middle school only, what it will generate based on the type of structures being built, and then obviously when it's going to be the earliest that they'll be completed. So what this all totals out to is approximately 77 middle school students to be generated from all of these properties. I think the other thing that has bubbled up a little bit with some information or some discussion around development on Foster Road. It's really too early to kind of get into the weeds on that. We work with the city of Napa. We get our information from the city of Napa, and there is not a lot of information being out there. There's some discussion that there may be some development on Foster Road down the road, but that's, you know, and it's potentially single family detached homes, but it's too early to make any kind of generations because there's really no plans out in there to share with anybody as of yet. There's just a lot of discussion around that's happening. So those are the significant housing developments happening in Napa. Now let's get back into, now let's go into the calculating the capacity. So you can go to the next slide. So we've used two different ways to load classes or schools in order to calculate the maximum capacity on a school site. I mentioned this at the last meeting. I was asked by somebody about this. So this is one of the ways we do it. So the first thing we do is we take the new construction eligibility that's outlined by the state of California. So if you were to build a new school somewhere in the state of California, they would calculate a new school based on a 25-to-1 ratio for grade 6 and a 27-to-1 ratio for grade 7 and 8. They do not take into consideration teacher preparation periods or anything like that. They just calculate it off of just a straight ratio of 25-to-1 or 27-to-1. So if we take those three numbers, we add them up, we divide by 3, we get a ratio of 26.33. It's a simplified ratio for using for high-level planning purposes at state, and it is a very conservative capacity for value for each site. The next ratio that we use, if you go to the next slide, please, would be using our MBSD and NBA collective bargaining agreement capacities. So in grades 6, 7, and 8, they can reach up to a maximum capacity of 36 students to 1, and a 6th grade class, a 7th grade class, or an 8th grade class. So assuming that all classes would be that size, we add all those numbers up, we divide by, which comes up to 108, we divide by 3, and that gives us obviously a ratio of 36 to 1. However, we're going to make the assumption in this because this is outlined in our collective bargaining agreement that teachers are given a prep period, that then we would allocate that prep period 5 out of 6 of the periods there. So they would, because one period would be taken up by the prep period. And we're going to say that classroom is not going to be used on the teacher's prep period. There are instances where you could use a classroom if you needed to on a teacher's prep period, but ideally you want to allow the teacher to have his or her room free during their particular prep period. So we would then load these classes at 5, 6, or 5 out of the 6 periods. Again, this is a pretty conservative approach, but if you take the 36 to 1 ratio, you times that by 5, divide it by 6, you become with a final ratio of 30 to 1. So again, two ratios we'll use, 26.33 to 1 and 30 to 1, and looking at capacity. So let's go to the next slide, please. So first up, we'll concentrate, we'll look at harvest. So just to you're going to see a very similar setup on each one of these school sites, but I'll walk you through this one. So we'll talk about the year constructed or significant milestones. So harvest was constructed in the approximately right around the year of 1954. As we know, right around 1982-83, it was closed and repurposed for other use. And then in 2003, it came back into fruition. It sits on 29 acres. There are a little over 123,000 square footage there. That doesn't include our formal central kitchen and warehouse space that is there right now. For the purpose of this, there are a total of 55 classrooms. For the purpose of capacity, though, we use 55. 26 are empty classrooms, and that includes the former River School that was on this particular campus. 24 classrooms are used for grades 6 through 8. And then I outline what rooms we don't use for capacity, and this is pretty similar from each site. We don't use the wellness center as in the capacity, the library, the classroom that's attached to the second gym, and then depending upon the particular school site, there's going to be some special education rooms available or used, and we will not count those for this capacity. And at Harvest, there's a speech office. Our 2021 enrollment is approximately 685 students. If we use the ratio of 26.33, you can see that we could have a capacity on the Harvest Middle School campus of 1,316 students. And if we use the 30 to 1 ratio which is our collective bargaining agreement ratio, we could have approximately 1,500 students on the capacity on the campus at Harvest Middle School. If you go to the next slide, then. So how does this compare again to their projected enrollment? So as you can see on the left-hand side, we have the actual enrollment, and you can see the trend is generally going down. And on the right-hand side is the projected enrollment. And then we put down the state planning and funding ratio of 26.33 and 30.1 for you to compare the two numbers to the current enrollment or the projected enrollment. And as you can see, there are a significant number of seats available at this particular campus. This does not, I mean, just so you know too, with our enrollment projections, it does include any of the residential developments I showed you before. So anything that we think would go to the Harvest way, we would include that data in here. It does not include any data around future potential district decisions, such as moving STC programs and that, or increasing or decreasing interdistrict enrollments on those sorts of things. Okay. So let's go down to the next slide, which is Redwood Middle School. So again, very similar setup as I shared. Redwood was also constructed in approximately the year 1954, went through a modernization in 2001, and then also a slight little modernization in 2010. Sits on a little bit more acreage, 37.4, a little less total square footage. Total classrooms there are 50, 45 used for this capacity, 5 not used. Their enrollment for 2021 was 809, the preliminary was, and then if you apply those ratios, Redwood at 26.33 could accommodate a little over 1,180 students. And if you apply the 30-to-1 ratio, they can move up to 1,350 for that. And again, we can go back one more time. Sorry, Dana. And then again, just to mention the rooms not used for capacity, very similar. The Wellness Center, there's a SPED speech office space. There's 2 SDC LH rooms, which is again a little bit different from other school sites. A sensory room, and then the classroom, and it's attached to the gym. Again, moving to the next slide. Again, very similar setup what we do here, so that you can see the actual enrollment on the left-hand side, and then the projected enrollment on the right-hand side. You get a sense of where the enrollment is actually going, and what it's gone over the last 3 years, and where it's headed over the next 5 years. And again, you can see and compare that to the two ratios that we use to load the campus. And you can see also a significant number of seats are available on that. Again, we take in consideration any kind of residential development that's been identified previously that we would put there, and it doesn't account for any district level decisions that could be made to increase or decrease on certain things. All right, next up is River Middle School. So this particular campus, the Salvador campus at that time was expanded in 1953. Then in 2019, it was modernized for River School. It sits on 9 acres. There are a little over 53,000 square feet. There are 22 classrooms on the site. 21 are used for the capacity. 2 of those classrooms currently are empty. 1 classroom is not used in this capacity. It's a kitchen lab, and it is not set up to have students on a regular basis. Their enrollment, and then the ratio, if we load it at 26.3, it can have a capacity of 553 students. And if we load it at 30-to-1, it can go up to 630 students. Next slide is, again, very similar. Again, same setup as I did before. And you can see their enrollment and because they do have more space than what they were currently allocated over at on the campus of Harvest Middle School, the former location. You can see that their enrollment actually does go up, and it's at 514 in 23-24, and then 2 years after that is just because our demographers aren't exactly sure where we're going to end up as how many students would end up coming into that particular campus. But we know we could accommodate, if we loaded at 26, we could accommodate 553 students, and if we loaded at 30-to-1, we could accommodate 630 students. Okay, next slide, Silverado, constructed in 1957, largest acreage at 40 acres, over 107,000 square feet, 47 classrooms, 41 were used for this capacity study. They currently have 11 empty classrooms and 30 classrooms used for grades 6 through 8. 6 classrooms are not used for this capacity. They have a specialized program out there. It's called the Gateway Program, and which occupies 3 classrooms on that particular campus. And then you can read the other ones that are used. Their enrollment is 732. We load them at 26.3. We can take a little over 1,000 students. We load them at 30-to-1. It climbs up to 1,230 students. And then again, same thing. Next slide again to give you the idea around their enrollment. And their enrollment is steadily declining too over the next several years. And again, you can compare that to the loading ratios we use of 26.3 and 30.1. Again, you can get an idea that there are a significant number of seats that are available currently and will be available in the near future. Lastly, we wanted to include American Canyon Middle School to give you an idea of what their capacity is, just as a comparison, even though we're concentrating on the schools in Napa. Constructed in '97, so it's a little over 9 acres, 92,000 square feet. 50 classrooms were used for this particular study, 46 were used for the capacity, and 4 rooms are not being used in this particular study. Their enrollment was a little over 1,000 students. We load them at 26. They can have an enrollment at a little over 1,200, and if we load them at 30 to 1, their enrollment can climb up to 1,380. And again, the next slide just again shows you a comparison of their actual and their projected enrollment. The main difference in this one, as you can see, is their actual and projected enrollments are all very similar, hovering anywhere from 1,011 students, 1,000 students, all the way up to a high of 1,043 is projected. So a very constant enrollment we project over the next several years happening out at American Canyon Middle School. But as you can see from the loading ratios, should be able to accommodate, we will be able to accommodate all of the number of the students out there, should they were to grow even more than what we're projected out as. Okay, the next slide gives you kind of a projected enrollment and capacity ranges and just kind of puts it all on one particular piece of paper within or slide. And this is just focusing again on schools in Napa. The first column is the current enrollment, and that's as of February 1st of this year. You'll see the projected enrollment for the next 3 years out, the state capacity, and then the MBUSD capacity. So if we look at currently, if we use the 26.33 number to load the classrooms, we have approximately 1,441 seats available. If we use the 30 to 1 ratio, we have a little over 2,018 seats available. Moving that out, if you go out to 23-24, again, the ratio of 23.33, you will have now 1,654 seats available. And if you load it 30 to 1, you'll have 2,231 seats available. And that's making the assumption that we would not close any school. But as you can see, we do have an abundance of seats in these particular combined over these 4 campuses. The next slide, I think, may address one of the questions that was asked when Mr. Manguala was giving his presentation. So in this particular slide, you can see the school enrollment analysis on the left-hand side and the number of residents enrolled by school. So you do take this into consideration when you're thinking about a school closure. So if we focus first, if we just take Redwood, which has the largest number of students, has 809 students, 91% of Redwood's enrollment resides in the boundary. So 91% of the 809 students attending reside in the boundary. And you can apply that again to that same idea to Silverado and to Harvest. So Silverado, with an enrollment of 732, 87% of that 732 of the Silverado enrollment resides in the boundary. And in Harvest, of the 685, 71% of the Harvest enrollment resides in the boundary there. River School is not mentioned, as was mentioned earlier, because they do not have an attendance boundary. They're 100% open enrolled to that. Okay. All right, let's go to talk a little bit about capital improvement. So we recently, one of the departments I oversee recently finished up conducting what we call a modernization program plan study. So we have really good data on what it's going to take to modernize our campuses throughout the entire district. And we focused on elementary, middle, and high school campuses. I want to emphasize that this is strictly to get us, we use a phrase, warm, safe, and dry. This is no new buildings. This is no new classrooms or anything. This is strictly modernization. So if we look at Redwood Middle School, if we were to do all the modernization that we did a study on, from mechanical, which is mainly HVAC, electrical improvements, plumbing improvements, the building envelope, which means what encapsulates the building. So we're talking roof, windows, and paint, and things like that, as well as any kind of technology modernization needs. And this is up till 2027. The projected cost at Redwood would be a little over $25 million. And again, that's if we did all of that. If we do an escalation out 3 to 5 years, which we use as approximately a 25% markup, it moves up to $30 million. And any work that we do, and some of this work we more than likely would have to take to the Division of State Architects to get approval, and anything that would trigger and when we do that, it may trigger a seismic upgrade and it may trigger an ADA upgrade. We have to factor in for that. And we use an escalation of approximately 35% on that. It takes now that up to $40 million on that. Again, I want to really emphasize the point here that this is strictly to modernize the campus. It is no new buildings, no new landscaping, no nothing like that. It is strictly modernizing the campus. So we can apply that same logic to next slide with Silverado Middle School. So Silverado's in their study was roughly a little over $21 million. Again, projected cost with the escalation 3 to 5 years out, a little over $25 million. And then if we have any seismic or ADA upgrades triggered by the Division of State Architects, then that price would move up to $34 million. And I think I'll mention something here, like you may be wondering, what triggers the Division of State Architects? So typically when we're doing anything structural, that is going to prompt us to have to go to the Division of State Architects. So if we have HVAC on top of buildings, which we do at almost all of our locations, that's a structural that we're going to have to take to the Division of State Architects. Conversely, if we were just to paint a school, that does not trigger DSA, and so you do not have to take that or trigger any kind of seismic or ADA upgrades. You do not have to take that to the Division of State Architects. And that wouldn't trigger any kind of escalation, but other things would definitely trigger some escalation on that. And can you go back to that one more for me? And then you might notice also too, there's a little bit difference between Redwood and Silverado. And part of that is because of some work that's going to be happening out at Silverado this summer. We have some emergency repairs we need to do on the gymnasium that's been leaking for several years. And so we're doing some re-roofing work out at the main Silverado gym this upcoming summer, which is why there's a little bit of a difference in the price between the two schools or the escalation. Okay, finally at Harvest. So again, we can apply, if we look at the next to last row, you can see the campus modernization number that is same things that we would apply at Silverado and Redwood would be to apply at Harvest as well too. So $23 million, and then with the escalation, it'd be 27, and then the seismic upgrade would be 37. However, we know that from an equity standpoint, and one of the things that was apparent of our modernization program plan study was the lack of equity from sites to sites out there that we needed to, and the board acknowledged as well too that we need to start to address is addressing that equity. So if you look at from that perspective, modernizing the administration office, which is out near Old Sonoma Road, which was formerly occupied by River, but used to be the old offices for the former Ridgeview campus. The projected cost to modernize that administration office, be able to tie in all your services, all your student services that you have and you need in administrative offices, would be in roughly a little over $2.5 million and escalating out 3 and then 4 million if you have to have any seismic upgrades on that. In addition, the performing arts. So I mentioned earlier how there's a former central kitchen and storage area. Well, that used to be where part of the performing arts of the former Ridgeview campus used to be located. And again, to bring some parity and equity between all the school sites if Harvest was to remain open, to modernize that would be over $14 million. If we don't get it, if we could not do that very soon, it would then we'd have to put some escalation onto that. That would be almost 17 million. And if it triggers any ADA, it would be over $22 million. There's a modernizing of their quad. The quad currently needs some has had the cracks filled in the quad to make it safe, but it is definitely in need of modernization, again, to bring it into some equity. The synthetic turf will need to be replaced in the very near future as well too. This would be the 3rd time that turf out there would be replaced. It received it was the first school to receive synthetic turf back, I believe, when the school was built, or at least or right after that. And then there's some other ancillary expense if we were to, currently remove or repurpose the current portables used for the harvest administration. There's some costs associated with that. So the estimated capital improvement costs, if we were to do those now, would be almost $43 million. Projected costs would be in the $50 million, and anything that triggers ADA would result in a capital improvement cost of $67 million, a little over $67 million. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that we highlight all of our schools. So River School was completed in January 2020. It was occupied by the campus. It is not going to need any capital improvements in the very near future, for obvious reasons. It is it's a brand new campus that has been upgraded and taken back down to the studs and then built back out with all the latest bells and whistles that we would like to be able to put into our other school sites here in Napa Valley Unified. And I think that's the next slide. Yeah, questions. So I conclude my presentation.
Sarah, you can go ahead and identify a question for us.
So the first question that is in this section, what is the land value or resale value of Harvest, Redwood, and Silverado middle schools, respectively?
Though normally the negotiations for those are handled by Mr. Manguala. I will say that we have not done any, I don't think we've done any appraisals. I mean, Mr. Manguala, you can comment on that, but I don't believe we've done any appraisals on those particular pieces of property.
There are a lot of variables that go into the valuation of property, especially former school sites. And so some of the things include residential entitlement. That would be, it's a very, very long process where you would have to work with the city. And depending on how that property was entitled, that would impact the value. So there's certainly not a firm number that we could give for any of the properties at all. So again, it's something where it's very theoretical until you actually nail down a proposal from a builder and the city were to actually approve it. So that's something that we can provide with an actual number right now.
Thank you. Sarah, next question.
The next question, will we have access to per campus site operational costs, annual costs, operational costs?
Yes, we could provide, I assume that the question means something around the utilities. We could certainly provide, yes, we can, I believe we can provide any kind of utility costs if that was the desire of the group.
Rob, when you presented the slide on operational cost, you mentioned it was for a large middle school. So would that estimate that you provided basically include something similar to Redwood, Silverado, Harvest?
Exactly. So it would be the number for Harvest and anything of that size. So the main difference when you get into middle schools, if holding everything constant, like the same number of a principal, a vice principal, and if you were to hold enrollment exactly the same, a lot of it comes into facilities maintenance costs. So a site like River, which is brand new and has a much smaller footprint, is going to be much lower than a school like Harvest, which is older and has a fair amount of deferred maintenance costs. And so when you look at that slide for $2 million, a lot of that is based on square footage. It's a calculation that we use determine the cost of maintaining the building.
Okay, so the three larger schools would be roughly similar to each other and be very similar to the estimate that you provided already.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, Sarah.
All right, the next question, there were several questions about busing, so I kind of consolidated them here. Asking for our data on the number of students currently using school busing per site and data on how many students would need busing due to any potential closures.
So I've gone back to the slide that shows the residence analysis, because I think this might be a place we could potentially provide an estimate. And Mr. Pearson, maybe you could mention a little bit about our current busing, who's being bused. I mean, right now, COVID, we're in a little bit different situation, but generally, some students are bused to some of these sites, correct?
Yeah, I'd have to get the exact numbers. I believe what I think I know, and I'd have to again check with transportation to confirm. I believe there are 2 buses that pick up in the Browns Valley area that take students to Harvest currently. And I believe there are at least 3 buses, and it might be 2, but let's say it's 3 in the McPherson area that take students out to Silverado. I have not explored the data with Redwood Middle School. That does not include any students that are bused for special education purposes or anything like that. That was just general education. But I could get more specifics at a future meeting.
Okay, thank you.
And I would want to add that the futuristic ask around projections around who we'd have to bus and when, it would be, we really couldn't realistically provide that because that would have to be contingent upon concrete scenarios. So I just want to call that out and be sort of candid about our potential to do that for future. If a school were to close, we couldn't project the number. We'd have to go school by school by school and then see who would opt for transportation or not. So providing what we bus now, if we can do that, but going through potential transportation scenarios would be a bit unruly.
Mike, if I could postulate here. So if you look at the percentage of residents, shouldn't there be an inverse relationship? So if you take Redwood and you say 91% of the students are within the boundary, if that school were to close, it would have the highest percentage of students bused. Does that make sense? Or
That's correct. Yeah, no, that's correct. I mean, that's one way you can look at it for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
The next question has to do with the current average class size in middle school. And as a follow-up, do any classes in any of the middle schools or do any middle schools currently operate at the 30-to-1 ratio used to define capacity?
I'd have to look at the school sites, and then I'm not completely familiar with the staffing ratio that is applied to the middle schools. Mr. Manguala might be able to do that. It could be that the average is a bit higher, but that's based on the staffing ratio that I shouldn't say the staffing number that they are assigned to by school site. And I don't know, Mr. Manguala, if you have anything to add to that.
Sir, I missed the beginning of that question.
The first part was, what is the average class size in middle school right now? And are any middle schools operating at the 30-to-1 ratio used to define capacity?
I do not know the average class size across the district. It really does vary by program within a middle school. PE tends to be higher than an English class. I do not know that number. I would imagine that it sits a little bit higher than that. So it's probably sitting around 32, 33 would be my guess.
I would support you in that estimate, Rob, given that some classes tend to go up higher, but also some are lower, and then there's additional staffing. If the question is also around operating at the 30-to-1 as defined by capacity, obviously we know none of our schools are operating at capacity at this point.
But I do think it's important to note that we use those numbers as a conservative approach. So you don't want to be too unconservative here. You have to, you want to be conservative to make sure that you have the capacity to account for any kind of growth. So that's why the state uses a number, but which is a fairly low number ratio wise, but we use the 30-to-1, and we're stating that would mean that every teacher's prep period, they would be a prep period without anybody in their classroom. You could, if you had an abundance of students on a particular campus and you needed to use a teacher's classroom on their prep period, you could do that. But this is baking in the assumption that we're not going to do that, that we're going to keep that room empty during that teacher's prep period.
There another question?
Next question, is it possible to see what facilities improvements have been made at each of the middle schools? Which school has had the most recent upgrades, and how is it determined which schools received improvements? And then there's also a question similar to that related to Measure H spending on each middle school.
So we did have that question before, and I think that there's some summaries out there on Measure H and recent expenditures, but I think we should place that question in the parking lot. It's really a question looking backwards on what has been spent. And remember, our task is looking forward on what we're going to do in the future. Now, if the expenditures at these sites change that outlook, given what additional work continues to need to be done, then it's something that we can point you in the right direction or give you that information, but that might be a nice to know as opposed to a need to know for the question at hand.
We can off the cuff just respond. The majority of Measure H dollars, if we were to talk about middle schools, the majority of Measure H dollars granted to a middle school were to River Middle School, and that was clearly demonstrated by Mr. Pearson's slide. It's a brand new facility. And then second would be American Canyon Middle School, which did get some capital improvements through Measure H. So that's just kind of off the cuff. That's where the dollars have gone.
And I can say that prior to that former measures, the 2010 was the other year where schools were improved, and I believe there was some work done on the science classrooms that were done, and some of that work as well. And there was, prior to that, there's some of the second gyms were built, but you know, between that time, Dr. Massetti is correct. The majority of money, I shouldn't say not majority of the money, but money spent on middle schools has gone to the River School and to American Canyon Middle School.
Okay. So Sarah, we do want to have some time for the small group breakouts. Are we close to finishing our questions here, or?
No, there's several more questions to get through, but we should probably transition to the processing activity in the interest of time.
And then we'll follow up on, we have those questions recorded so we can come back and try to provide that information.
Yes.
Okay, so then let's go ahead and talk about our processing activity. So what we thought we would do, again, so we can give the small groups as much time as possible to be looking again at the data and processing it together, is that we would go ahead and have our panelists exit the meeting and head to their small groups. Remember, when you return to this group and you're in the attendee mode, to go ahead and click your raise hand so we can get you back on as a panelist for our final share out. And then while they're transitioning, and you can go ahead and go, Sarah, unless you want to say something else to them, your facilitators there will explain the activity to you. We're going to explain for the audience at home and for anybody watching the recording later on what's happening in the activity off camera. So we'll go ahead and ask our group to go ahead and get to their small groups. And while they're transitioning, Sarah, do you want to just talk about what they will be doing in the small group?
Yep. So during the processing time today, they will be in their small groups. They will be completing a data mining protocol, and I'll explain what that protocol looks like on the next slide. Then they'll be identifying further need to knows beyond the questions that they identified on the participant guide that I was reading. Some of them, we didn't get to all of them. So they'll continue to identify need to knows for future sessions. And then they'll return back to the whole group. You can go to the next slide, Dana. So the purpose of the data mining protocol is to further illuminate data. And in this case, all of the participants did receive the slides containing the presentations by Mr. Manguala and Mr. Pearson prior to tonight. So they will have gotten a little jump start on the protocol. The steps for the protocol are to examine the data closely, to look for different trends, and then they're going to describe the data. So they're going to describe new learning, what do they see in the data, what strikes them as significant, and the facilitator in each small group session is going to make sure that everyone has a chance to describe what they see. And then the next step will be to interpret the data and to come up with I wonder statements and some analysis that can be charted by the note taker and then shared out during whole group. And they're going to separately do this protocol with the presentation, the data from the presentation by Mr. Manguala, and then they'll do the same protocol with the presentation data from Mr. Pearson. and then they'll come back and each small group will share out their results of this protocol.
So we're gonna, Sarah, I think I neglected to ask the group to be back at 7:40, so we have time to share. Can you maybe write into the protocol at the top, maybe in bright red letters,
Mhm.
to return back to the group at 7:40, ready to share?
Yeah, I
And
can.
then for those of you who are with us right now, so it would be a great time if you'd like to take a quick intermission break, and we'll be back here ready to share and hear from the groups at 7:40. Okay, it looks like people are making their way back in, and we still have a couple people with their hand up in the attendee area. We have Mr. Drazel, Catherine Fleming. Let's see if there's anybody else. Don't think so. And we are slowly repopulating in here on the panelist side. All right. Okay, we'd like to give every group, so Sarah, there's 7 groups, is that correct?
Yes.
So we have 7 groups, so, and we have just under 21 minutes, so we'll do 2.5 minutes for each group to share out. Will that work?
Yep.
Okay, and do we have, looks like a few more attendees, Mr. Ruiz, we have a few more attendees who are still waiting to be promoted to panelists, but I think we can go ahead and get started if we have our group number 1 spokesperson, if they're ready to go and share with us. Who would be our first group spokesperson be?
Group A is Elizabeth's group.
Okay, anybody from group 1 ready to share? Hopefully they're back. Why don't we go to group 2? Do we have group 2 ready?
That's Stephanie's group.
I think I saw Stephanie back here. No?
We can go to group C and come back. That's Monica's group is group C.
Okay, and I did see Monica back, so I'm guessing that the rest of her group is here. Can we go ahead and have group C start us off with the share out tonight?
Sure, I can report out. So some of the things that were talked about, that there seems to be a similar distribution of demographics across middle schools, with the exception of River Middle School. And another observation was that Harvest Middle School seemed to have the most need in terms of free and reduced lunch, EL students, and the highest population of Latinx students. And so when thinking about the charge of leading with equity, when we're thinking about equity, equity is about serving those with the least and providing them with the most support, right? So if HMS, Harvest Middle School, were to close, what is the thinking about how they will receive the most support, right? So that's an important thing to really think about here. And what does that support look like if we're thinking about equity? Also, a third, more cost maintaining Harvest Middle School versus other sites. So how much does that figure into the ultimate decision? There's about a 20 million differential approximately. And a small middle school was built in North Napa. So that was just another kind of wondering that, you know, there's a small middle school that was built in North Napa that does not reflect the student demographics of NVUSD. And so just one final need to know is just more clarification about the data of each school site, in particular about numbers of ELLs at each site. Does that include the bilingual program and ELLs? Are those two populations together, or are they separate? Thank you.
Thank you, Orlando. I'm going back to group A, Elizabeth's group. Did you have a person who can share out?
I'm not seeing them. How about we continue?
Okay. I did see Stephanie. So Stephanie, do you have a person that can share out from group B?
Yes, it is moi. Nice to see you. I'm sorry we're late. We didn't know what our total time was, so I apologize for that. Okay, so our interpretations on the enrollment and budget side. One, it was evident, it's very clear that decision needs to be made sooner than later to stay fiscally responsible while acknowledging the impact that this is going to have on families and staff. Another outcome of our conversation is that with declining enrollment and the closure of middle school, obviously certificated and classified will follow the students. However, administrator costs will need to be consolidated. So it will be, another difficult outcome of this decision. Some analysis that we did on all of this is that in the end, Harvest Middle School is just over 52% full. And unfortunately, it had the largest price tag of upgrades when you consider the seismic costs of $67 million. So we just noticed that it fell on both sides, the wrong side of both of those areas. And then in the area of budget, it seemed clear that maintaining a 7% reserve is just a non-negotiable, and it needs to be something that as a district we are maintaining, so we keep our independence. On the facility side, it was evident that it wouldn't make sense to close a school that was recently upgraded or constructed, American Canyon Middle and River. And then when we learned all this information from Mike about Napa Pipe, I don't think anyone can consider that as a game changer down the road at all for enrollment, as much as it had been hyped to be that years past. We didn't really get too many need to know. Again, a lot of data, a lot to process, but someone did wonder on when we were looking at that Napa Pipe piece, how do they come up with projected students based on new housing? Like, how do we know there's only some number of middle school students out of 800 dwellings? Just was more of a wonder. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Moving on to Group D, Carlisa's group. Carlisa, do you have a person who can represent Group D?
Yeah, that's me. So we were talking about, one of the first points that we were talking about was the 29% of the non-residents at Harvest. And we just wanted to make sure that it was noted that this was actually a positive, that we have a 29% non-residents attending the school. And it's most likely due to the dual immersion program. It's a way of diversifying the school, where we have different people from across the community driving in for that program. I know it wasn't clearly stated, but I think we can make that assumption that that 29% or most of the 29% is due to the dual immersion program. We also talked about, students that were being bused, and, we made an assumption that students that are currently bused may be economically disadvantaged. So as we're moving forward and making, decisions, this is a piece that we all have to consider, because it is, an equity issue as we're looking at students that need to be bused. We did have several questions that came up, needs to know, in regards to enrollment and then facilities. There was a question that came up about the seismic and ADA costs and how and why they were in a separate column. Why were they not included as an overall cost? Because these are items that are required as you're making projections for buildings. There was a question too on who is checking the projected costs, just to make sure that they are accurate. There was a question that came up about the modernization of the quad at Harvest. It was listed as a specific cost in Measure H, but it looks like there was a different cost. And so there was a question around that, just to, answer that. And then one of the slides, the Silverado modernization slides, it seemed like some of the information was missing. So some of the information needs to be updated. So Mike was going to work on that just to make sure that they were accurate. There was a question about the attendance area for Silverado. It looks like it's rather large. So as we're looking at consolidating boundaries, how does that affect Silverado, since it does impact pretty large community? And then the last question that came up was the percentage of NDLA and PV students that are moving into Harvest and continue into the DLI program, just a need to know as to how many, what percent of students are continuing on to middle school.
You okay? I'm sorry that I couldn't listen to you earlier.
Someone needs to mute.
And
And that's it for Group D.
Thank you, Alejandra. Going back to Group A, if we can go back to Elizabeth's group and have someone from Group A report out.
Sure, I'll report out. So just a couple of the highlights of our discussion. We talked about how open enrolled schools has had a huge impact in terms of looking at inequities among the different middle schools. Also talked about the concern with so many seats, like 2,200 seats that will be open in a few years, and how that's going to really, it's not going to be able to help maximize the performance of different programs, and also looking at how it's going to have an impact on employees as well. Also talked about how we were really surprised that the housing development were not going to provide as many students as we expected, that number was a lot less than we thought it would be. We had a little conversation just in terms of the impact that the NVLA sixth grade not being at Harvest has had at the numbers at maybe, but would have had impact on the sixth grade at Harvest as well. And I think some of the other comments that were already made, but I was just listening to Alejandra, were very similar to what we were kind of discussing as well. And we didn't have any need to know.
Oh, thank you, Franklin.
Sure.
All right, moving to Group E. Matt,
We get D. Just,
we did get Group D. Yes.
okay, great. Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, yeah, thank you. So I'll go ahead and speak on behalf of Group E. So with budget enrollment, we talked about, our conversation really centered on the possibility of, knowing that there's a need to close, to consolidate middle schools, the possibility of building stronger educational programs for students. That's really one of the only ways to do that is to look at consolidating middle schools based on the data that was presented. We talked about the dual immersion program, and that there's not that one of the elementary dual immersion programs goes through 5th grade, the other goes through 6th grade, and some wonderings about the implications on that for middle school. And there was questions about the possibility and the potential benefits of a K-8 dual immersion program. We looked at, then the conversation switched to a pretty significant conversation about River School. The fact that River School looks very different from the demographic of other schools, of other middle schools in Napa. As other groups have mentioned, it's the newest, most up-to-date school, so some equity questions were raised around that. We talked about boundaries and some questions around the redrawing of boundaries and what that process looks like. How were those original boundaries created? And then with regard to facilities, housing implications around closing schools, could if properties were sold, would that potentially increase housing and increase enrollment in Napa? Building schools, again, to meet programmatic need, or building or renovating schools to meet programmatic need. And then wondering about if there's a plan to sell campuses and what that process would look like if they're consolidated.
Thank you, Matt. Moving to Group F.
Yeah, okay, I'll speak for our group. First of all, a lot of what we discussed has already been brought up by other groups, but I just want to highlight a few things. First of all, it's clear that this needs to be done. I think looking at the data, and the fact it kind of begs the question of why we weren't looking at this maybe last year. For me as a teacher too, bringing up the point that it's going to require some shrinkage amongst staff, and I feel bad about my colleagues. And it's always tough to lose teaching positions. The issue with River School and the demographics came up in our group as well. a bit troubling and looking at that and how that demographic doesn't reflect the demographics of the city. And thinking about ways where we can try and balance that as you build up the capacity of River School with the goal of also trying to take care of balancing that demographic issue at that school. Let's see, we looked at or talked a little bit about the outside of district students coming in and what effect that actually has and how many of them are there actually. Let's see what else here. The NVLA issue of sixth graders was difficult to, when looking at the graphs, I think the preference would have been to look just entirely at all sixth graders, was a comment in our group. Also, the issue with those graphs having different colors for different graphs for different schools, if we could make that uniform, it might have been a little bit easier to get a grasp on. Then looking at facilities, the cost of dry, safe, and warm seems somewhat astronomical, actually. And we're wondering about how often those kind of costs have to be incurred by school sites. And then a question came up about liquidation. Is that a part of the conversation, whether or not we will take that into consideration of the property value of the property that is closed, and does that factor at all into the conversation? And then what about expansion in the future? If we liquidate a site, we don't have that resource anymore. Do we have space on other sites to expand if the necessity is there? And are there better suited sites than others for that? A couple need to knows. Wanted to know a little bit more about clarity on open enrollment and that process, and about our clientele's ability to navigate that system, and whether or not that factors into some of the demographic imbalance that we saw. And also, how do we market? Is that still a factor? Can we market our schools to people outside the district? And can we bring in more students that way to try and generate more enrollment? And that's our summary.
Thank you, Chuck. And last, moving to Group G.
Yeah, I'll share out for Group G. So we had really similar observations and wonderings as other groups, but something we did notice was that the enrollment drop off for Silverado seemed to be a little bit less significant than that of Harvest and Redwood. We had a lot of discussions about demographics at the different schools, and had some wonderings about River as well. And a question that came up for us was how would you go about shifting the demographics of River Middle School to more accurately reflect the demographics of our community? So that was something that we wondered. We also had some questions about the capital improvements. We noticed that the Performing Arts Center was only listed under capital improvements need to be made for Harvest. So we wondered why that's not included for the other schools, because we noticed if that had been removed, that the price of capital improvements at Harvest was a little bit closer to the other than what was needed at the other schools. And then we thought that there might be some pending capital improvement projects going on at Harvest that seemed to be lumped in to the projection, but not lumped into the projection at Silverado, if that makes sense. So those were kind of our need to knows.
Great. Thank you. And thank you again, Sarah, for developing the activity and getting all of our facilitators up to speed so that we could do that in the small group. So we're at the end of our time. There was one, we will try to circle back with a lot of the questions and needs to know, and we have them captured, but there was one question that came up, and I'm just going to ask Mr. Pearson if he's there. Do you want to briefly address the difference at Harvest Middle School with some of the additional projects that were on that particular slide, and why the difference?
Yes, I can briefly go over that. What the difference is to bring the sites up to equity or equal levels. So currently at Harvest, they do not have a stage, like a performing arts stage is what that you have at Silverado and Redwood. And so that's the main difference that you would see at those schools, that they don't have that. They do have visual and performing art classrooms, but they do not have a stage area, which was taken over by the central kitchen or the old central kitchen when the campus was closed, back in 1982. So that's what, if we were to bring that up to the standard that we see currently at the other middle schools, that's why that expense is so great. And it's extremely costly, everybody. I mean, it's the reality.
Okay, thank you. I hope that helps a little bit. And again, we're at the end of our time and we do have a commitment to end on time. So again, I just want to thank you for a very productive session tonight. We only have 1 week in between this session and next session, and we have this short week. So we're going to try to get the information to you out this week so that you have it again ahead of time, and then we'll be back at it next Tuesday. And so in the meantime, again, thank you. Enjoy your weekend. And
Dana, can I make one announcement? I'm so sorry.
Sure, absolutely.
You guys did a lovely job on doing succinct, timely closure. I just do want the task force to know. So we have the cadence of every 2 weeks, our family newsletter goes out, and we are promoting engagement, directing everybody to the website about observing. We're trying to make this a very public process so that people can kind of learn and study the issue alongside us. But we know that the format that we've chosen is sort of representatives from across our stakeholder groups, across, different cross sections of parents, administrators, teachers, et cetera, from all of the different schools. And so this format doesn't really provide an opportunity for community input. So I wanted to let you know, as Dana said, next week we'll have the focus on instruction and program as she's laid out in the sequence of the agendas. And then when we get to session 4, we will get to scenarios. And so, this task force will have a substantial time to really dive into those scenarios. But we do think it's important to create a venue for community input on scenarios as well. So outside of the task force, we're going to be, we've got some tentative dates that we're trying to finalize on the district calendar. Outside of the task force space, we will invite community in a town hall sort of format to, listen to the scenarios once this group has gone through sort of a vetting discussion process in session 4, and we'll take them out to the community. And then we'll encourage task force members to also tune in and listen so that you've got your perspectives and your vantage point, but you can also get a more comprehensive view of how the community feels about various scenarios at that town hall. And so we're working on the date. I'll get that out to all of you so that you can also, if you can make it and calendar it and listen in and tune into that as well. We think that's an important sort of input piece as we walk through this journey. So stay tuned on that date. We'll get it out shortly, and then we'll communicate it district-wide.
Great. Thank you so much. That was an important announcement. Thank you for adding that. And with that, I will say thank you and good night to everybody. Take care.